I don't think Britain actually will end up leaving the European Union, and this is why. The European Union's lived through referendum shocks before. In 1992, the Danes voted to reject the Maastricht Treaty. The Irish had voted to reject both the Nice and Lisbon treaties. And anyone who's followed the EU knows that at the time, those were enormous shock events, not quite on the scale of Brexit, but people in Brussels thought the roof was caving in. And then in the end, what they did was they renegotiated the deals with the countries involved, they gave them some concessions, they held a second referendum, and the show rolled on. So that's the precedent, and that's why it makes me think that the decision of the British in the referendum is not necessarily as definitive as many people think that it is at the moment. A lot will depend on what's in the politicians' heads at the moment, and I think if you look both in Britain and in Europe, you can begin to see where a compromise might be found. Boris Johnson, who was probably the most important figure in the Leave campaign, actually said back in February that Europe never gives proper concessions until the people first say no. And he clearly had in mind the Danish referendum in 1992, which incidentally he covered as a journalist in Brussels at the time. So he was very familiar with this idea of second referendums, and I think there was a very strong hint in that that's what he's looking at. The question is, would people in Europe be prepared to give Britain those concessions that might be necessary to allow them to stage a second referendum with some kind of face-saving device? The current mood in Europe is very hard-line, but it's also very divided. And if you listen to some of the most important players, particularly in Germany, which is now the dominant power in the EU, within the finance ministry, within the ruling party, there are people saying Brexit needn't be definitive, maybe we can negotiate some kind of associate membership. And the dividing line between associate membership and actual membership is a very blurred one already, because Britain doesn't join the euro, it's not in Schengen, the passport-free zone, so negotiating some kind of new opt-out I don't think is impossible. I think the key issue that's already emerging is this whole question of free movement of people. Personally, I think that's what lost the referendum. It was the inability of David Cameron and the Remain side to say to the British people, there is some upward limit on migration from Europe. And that gave power to the Leave campaign slogan of take back control. They need to be able to, in a second referendum, say, we've got control. Now, the key will be to find a way of preserving free movement of people, which is a crucial principle of the EU, I can't see them giving up, and somehow finding a control mechanism. And that key, I think, is what is known as an emergency brake. So what the British will be arguing for is to say to the Europeans, look, what you should give us, and something we could win on, is don't roll back free movement of people, but say that if it surges to a particularly high level, that a country, Britain or anyone else, it has to be a general rule, can say, okay, we're taking a time out for a year or two, we're imposing a limit. So that, for example, Britain in the immediate period after 2005 took 1 million people in from Poland, and that, I think, was regarded widely as too big a shock to the system. Now, those kinds of shocks are unlikely to happen ever again, because that was immediately after accession. But if you can give people reassurance that if it were to happen again, we can take back control, then I think a second referendum is winnable. It was only lost by 52 to 48%, roughly. This is a 2% swing you need, and given everything that's happened since then, it's eminently winnable if you have that emergency brake.
A negotiation with the European Union will need to begin under a new Prime Minister. And I think it's right that